Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name's Nader. This is going to be a video where we go through a bunch of exercises on generators in JavaScript together. We looked at generators in the previous video, and it was a way to create iterators in a much easier syntax and a more modern syntax. Went through kind of how it's a way to do lazy evaluation, as well as kind of create these things that work very similar to how async await works, but with synchronous code. So that said, if you want more practice with generators, definitely check out the exercises in this, as it is a more complicated topic for sure. And we're actually only exploring half of the concept of generators before we can get to future videos where we can explore into more detail about how they work. Let's get right to the exercises. Okay, so as with all the other exercises, I have a warm-up with a bunch of comments at the top. I'm going to go through kind of an explanation of what the exercise is one at a time, give you a chance to do it yourself, and then we'll go through a potential solution together. So for the warm-up, we're going to want to create a generator function that's called count to 10 that will yield the numbers between 0 and 10 inclusive and then stop. So it's going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 all the way up to 10, and then it's going to stop. Okay. We want to create the generator object by calling the generator function and then iterate through our generator object using a for of loop. Okay, so a for of loop syntax allows us to actually loop through an iterable, which a generator object is. So once you've created a generator function, make the object and then loop through it. Give that a shot and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so let's do const count to 10. We saw that we create a generator function by using the function star keyword. And then inside of here, we're allowed to use the yield statement, which is very similar to kind of how await works, but it can work synchronously. So in here, we want to yield the numbers from 0 to 10. So I could do like yield 1 and then 2 or 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 10. But I'll just keep this much easier. I'll just say let I equal 0, and I'll say while I is less than or equal to 10, what I'm going to do is yield I. Okay, and then I'm going to make sure that I increment I and go up by 1, so this doesn't end up being an infinite loop. If it was an infinite loop, that'd be fine. We would just have to deal with it outside of the generator using some other kind of a loop construct. All right, so this is going to generate 10 different values, and then it's going to actually stop. Then we want to create the generator object, which is step 2. So here we're going to say const, I'll just call this generator object here. And this is going to be the count to 10. And we can use a for of loop to loop through this generator object. So I'll say for const for each value inside of our generator object, we are going to console.log out the value. Now, each value is actually going to be an object with in the object syntax where we have a value property and a done property, but let's actually take a look at what this looks like. So I'm going to pull up my terminal, make sure I'm in the correct folder, run a node warmup exercise.js, and we're going to see that we get a 0 through 10. So if we were to do this manually using the .next property, we would actually be able to see the full form of this object behind the scenes of what the generator creates for us, which we saw in the previous video. However, with the iterable syntax, we actually pull out the value directly, and the done property is kind of hidden from us because that's what the for of loop is using to actually check to see if it's done or not. Perfect. So just to kind of show that to you, just for sake of example, I just want to do a generator object.next right here. I'm going to call it one time. So this is going to give us a 0, and then we're actually going to see the object itself. So here we see that we get 0, and then we get done of false. And when we actually start the loop, we actually start at 1 because we've already exhausted the 0 and pulled it out of the generator, and we cannot kind of go backwards in a generator. It's always stuck in the state that it currently is. Perfect. Let's check out exercise number 1. So for this one, we want to create a generator function called random number that's going to infinitely generate new random numbers for us. Okay, and we're going to use a loop to generate 10 random numbers using the generator object we get from calling random number. So this is a bit tricky, okay, because this generator, unlike our warm-up one, which actually stops at 10, this one's going to be infinite. We're just going to have an infinite while loop, for example, in this generator that's going to just constantly generate random numbers for us. Okay, how are you going to use the actual generator object in such a way that you can kind of manually pull out numbers and control how many loops we actually go through. So the hint here is you probably don't want to use a for of loop. Technically, you can in certain ways, but you might even just be able to use a regular while loop or a for loop to actually loop through this. If you do use a for of loop, make sure to actually just use the break keyword in the same way you would use for a regular for loop. I'll give you a chance to try this out yourself, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so I'll show you kind of the different ways we can actually go about this. First, I'll create the actual function. So I'll say const, I'll say random number is equal to a function star, which is our generator. And inside of here, we're going to create an infinite loop. Now we're allowed to do this because inside of a generator, it actually pauses at the yield statement. So as long as the synchronous code kind of outside of our generator actually makes use of this and pulls the values out as needed, it's not going to cause an issue and hang up our Node.js thread. So in this case, if we just yield out a math.random number, what we'll get is a random number generated every single time we actually call the next on our generator object once we create it. So then I'll create my generator object, and I'm just going to keep this consistent. Normally you'd want to give this a different name, but just so that we can see the object throughout these exercises, I'll just call it generator object for now. And here we're actually going to call this random number. We're going to get back our generator object. Now, I'll do this first with a while loop, then I'll do it with a for loop, and then a for all loop, just so we can see the differences. So first I'll do a for loop. So I'll say for let I equal 0. I don't actually have a condition, so I'm actually going to skip the condition, and we saw this in the for loop video. I'm going to make sure I goes up by 1. Then I want to, in this case, say, actually, sorry, I do have a condition. I want to say while I is less than 10. If we skip the condition, it would be an infinite loop. I'm getting mixed up with my next exercise and getting too excited. We want to actually log out the next value from our generator. So we're going to say console.log generator object.next, and we can do this manually. Okay, so this is kind of what I was hinting at. A for of loop grabs the next value automatically and handles a done behind the scenes. In our case, we actually need to call next manually, and it's actually going to give us the object itself. So technically we can pull out the value property off of this. I'll show you what I mean in a second. So if I pull this up and I run node exercise1.js, what we'll see is 10 random numbers being generated because our loop is going to stop using the I variable at 10, but we're actually logging out the entire object. So to log out just the value, since we're using this syntax, we want to actually grab the .value, and if we rerun this, we'll see that we just get 10 random numbers. Okay, so that is the for loop syntax. The while loop syntax is very similar. We can say let I equal 0, and we can say while I is less than 10. Then what we want to do is we want to console.log generator object.next.value. Same thing as we did over here. And if I run this, what we'll see is kind of the same result except with different random numbers. Oops, and as usual, I always forget to say I++, and this is why sometimes a for loop is a little bit easier to reason about, but here we can get our 10 random numbers. All right, so that's a while loop and a for loop, and then finally I just want to show you the for of loop where we can use our break. So scroll down a little bit just so we can see this. I'll say for const, and I'll say for each value of our generator object, and actually rename this differently. I'll just say for each item of our generator object, just so I can use value in a second. I want to console.log out that item. But if I do this, since this generator is effectively going to be infinite, right? I have no way of breaking out of this, right? So if I run this, I'm just going to get a bunch of random numbers infinitely, right? And I have to manually exit that with my terminal. So same kind of thing. We want to find a way to actually keep track of our counter. So I can say, for example, that I equals 0, then I can do an I++, and then I can do an if I is equal to, for example, 10, then I can break. Okay, that would be one way to actually do this. There's many ways to do this inside of for of loop. However, you can probably see the syntax, depending on which kind of method you like, is potentially a little bit more verbose, because traditionally speaking, a for of loop is really meant to loop through every single item inside of a generator. So if we had an infinite generator, we want to actually manually call the .next, and maybe this for of loop is not what we want. But just to show you that this works, you can see that we actually get our 10 different numbers. Okay, Cool. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. It's kind of nice to see these laid out this way. And in this case, we're using an infinite generator, so that's pretty cool. We wouldn't be able to run this code normally. It would hang up our thread if we weren't actually controlling what's coming out of the generator in our other bits of code. Let's look at exercise number 2. All right, so for this one, we want to create a generator function called random amount from range. And this is going to have 3 parameters, an amount, a min, and a max. Okay, so this function is going to actually have parameters. This is the first time we're seeing a generator function have parameters. Okay, but it's just like any other function, we can provide it with parameters. This function, this generator function, random amount from range, is going to generate the random amount of numbers provided as an argument. So what that basically means, between the min and the max, which is going to be inclusive. So what that basically means is this, right? Imagine if we had random amount from range and we provided these 3 arguments, right? 3 for amount, 10 for min, and 20 for max. That means that we want to generate 3 numbers between 10 and 20 inclusive. So we might get something like this, for example, right? And every time we run it, we should get 3 different random numbers. Okay. Then what we want to do is we want to create a for-of loop that will loop through the generator objects to actually test it. And we want to try these different generator objects, right? We want to create a generator object that does 3 values between 10 and 20, 5 values between 100 and 200, and then 10 values between 1,000 and 2,000. So these are all generator objects, and we need to loop through it using a for-of loop to actually extract the .next values out of them. Okay, so quite a bit going on here. You're gonna have to kind of figure out, how do you generate a random number between a min and a max? How do I kind of deal with these parameters? And then how do I yield those values properly and then actually test it with these different values? So go ahead and give that a shot. This is definitely meant to be a bit challenging. So do your best and we'll go through it together. Okay, so to start, let's start by creating our random amount from range. So I'm going to say const random amount from range, and this is going to be a function star. Oops. And in this function star, we want to have 3 parameters, amount, min, and max. So those parameters, just like any other function, go right here, amount, min, and max. So we want to generate this many random numbers between the min and the max inclusive. All right, so how do we generate a number between 2 numbers? So I'm just gonna do a bit of Googling here just so you can kind of see how that would work in a real workflow. I'll just pull up Google. I'm gonna say JavaScript random number between 2 numbers, something like that, right? Generating a random number between 2 numbers in JavaScript. I'll pull up this Stack Overflow article. Maybe I'll also pull up this math.random here. That sounds promising. So zoom in on this a little bit. So this is saying this math.random we saw returns random number. That's not what we want. Math.floor of math.random times max. So that's between, it looks like, a 0 and the number. Okay, so not really quite what we want, I don't think. Because what if the min is different, right? So we don't always want to start at 0. So pretty close. Let's check out Stack Overflow. Just pull up zoom a bit here. So here, Stack Overflow, how do I generate a random number? So here, yep, they're asking, between a different min, so that's not 0, so that's good. Random int from interval. Oh, look at this, a function, so nice. So we want to do math.floor of math.random multiplied by max minus min plus 1 plus min. Wow, okay. So normally what you'd want to do, and I did this beforehand, and I've actually used this function many times myself beforehand, but what you'd want to do is really just write this out and calculate it yourself, right? Like give it a different max and a min, like maybe 10 and 5 or 20 and 3 or something, and make sure that it actually works. I know that this formula works, so I'm just going to use it. But again, don't copy and paste, right? Definitely just write it out yourself. You're going to get your muscle memory kicking in the more that you actually write this out. So I'll switch back to VS Code, and I'm going to say that inside of here, I want to basically generate a random amount of numbers between that min and max. Okay, so I need to actually create that many random numbers. So if I get 5, I want to generate 5 of these, for example, right? So I need to loop that many times. So how do I loop and basically amount of times? right? So there's a few ways we can kind of do this. We can use basically a while loop, or we can use a for loop. So I'll actually just go with the for loop syntax since this is a bit more concise. I can say for let I equal 0, and I can say while I is less than amount, and then I plus plus. So this is going to loop that many times. So for example, if I have 3, this loop is going to execute 3 times. If I have 5 times, etc. And inside of here, since this is a generator function, I can yield out the values instead of returning them, because the return would stop the function. So if I yield out math.floor of math.random, let's take a look at what they said. We want to do max minus min plus 1, kind of in brackets. So multiplied by max minus min plus 1. Luckily, our parameter names match. And then they said we want to do a plus a min at the end. Okay, so you definitely, like I mentioned, you want to make sure that you actually do this calculation a couple times and not just trust random answers on the internet. But I've already done this many times myself, and I know that this is the correct formula. Okay, so that is going to generate that many random numbers between that min and that max that many times. Perfect. So now we want to generate our actual object. So I'm going to say const, and I'll just go with the same name here, generator object, just to keep it consistent with the other exercises. And this is going to call random amount from range. And I want to test it with a few different values. So I want to test it with 3, 10, and 20. Let me just do that first, and I'll do the other ones. So if I use a for all loop, I'll say for each item of our generator object, I want to console.log out the item dot, or in this case, it's actually not that value because we actually have the value. So I can actually replace this with value. I always get confused with the regular for loops and the for all loops with generators. So hopefully what we're going to see when we do this is we're created our generator object, which is going to start yielding out, in this case, 3 values between 10 and 20 inclusive. And we can use a for all loop to use it as an iterable to actually loop through and pull out those values. Okay, so let's see if we actually get that. So I'm going to run a node, and this is going to be exercise 2. And check it out, 18, 18, 19. So is that random? I don't know. Maybe it's just, yeah, okay, there we go. Kind of random. There we go, between 10 and 20. I think that's right. Am I going to get a 20 in there somewhere? Maybe not. Maybe eventually. That seems right to me. Okay. Now I want to see if this actually works with the other cases. So if I kind of duplicate this and I create a generate object 2 and generate object 3, for example, just to be a bit lazy with my naming, and I'll just copy and paste this for the sake of time since it's very, very similar. This is going to be generate object 3, 2, and 3. And the differences here is that for 2, I want to go 5 numbers between 100 and 200. And then for 3, I want to go from 10 numbers, sorry, between 1000 and 2000. All right, so we saw that this one works, so I'll comment that out for now. I'll also comment the last one just to make sure that we can look at these one at a time. So we want to see generate object 2, 5 numbers between 100 and 200. That seems to work great. Just run it one more time. Perfect, nice. And I'll comment that one out. And then for my last one here, generate object 3, which is 10 numbers between 1000 and 2000. Let's see what we get. Awesome, look at that. Cool, all right. Pretty cool, right? Definitely pretty cool. So this was meant to really show how you can actually provide different parameters for these functions and actually give them arguments to actually make them do different things. This is even just scratching the surface of the power of generators, but already we can do a lot of really cool things with this. So let's go to exercise 3. This is going to be quite a doozy, so prepare yourself for this one. All right. So for this one, we want to create a generator function called getRandomNumber. Okay, and this is going to generate a random number between 1 and 10 inclusive, but it's going to do this exactly 5 times. All right, and you'll see why in a second. Then we want to create another generator function called grocery list. Inside of grocery list, we want to create a variable called groceries that points at this array right here. So this array of strings, avocado, cookie, milk, soup, and soda. Okay. The generator, so this generator right here, grocery list, is going to yield a random grocery item from groceries and will remove that grocery item from the list of groceries. So effectively what that means, it's going to give us back, for example, say milk, but it's going to remove milk from this array. So now this grocery array only has 4 items left, avocado, cookie, soup, and soda. Okay, so you can think of it working kind of like this. Let's say that we have groceries, which is going to be our grocery list. If we call next on it, we're going to pull out cookie. Then we'll call next on it again. We might pull out soup, right? So if we did that, then we would only have avocado, milk, and soda left. Okay, so we wouldn't be able to pull them out using next again. Then we want to create the generator objects, kind of very similar to what we did right here for each of these two functions, but also for getRandomNumber. And then we want to create a regular for loop or a while loop that's going to loop exactly 5 times, and it's going to call next, very similar to this, on each of the generator objects. So both the getRandomNumber as well as the grocery list generator object, okay, that we end up creating. And it's going to print out a random number followed by a random grocery. So you can think of it like as a random grocery kind of shopping list. Okay, so we might get like 5 avocados, right? Or 10 soups, right? In this case, the S's are missing. So you could probably think of how you could deal with that case where if it's one item, it's singular and multiple is plural, but we'll keep it simple for now and we'll just get this generator working. So this is probably one of the more complex ones. Definitely don't expect you to get this on your first try, but try your best. The hardest part about this is not only creating these generator functions and getting the array stuff working with actually removing stuff. We looked in a previous set of exercises how you can do that with arrays, but also kind of how do they tie together and then kind of have these numbers printed out right beside the generator for the grocery list as well as the random number. So give that a shot yourself and then we'll go through it together. All right, so let's go through this together. So for this one, we want to create getRandomNumber. So I'll say const getRandomNumber, and this is going to be a function that generates a random number between 1 and 10. But so it's going to be a generator function. So function star, and this is going to yield a random number between 1 and 10, but exactly 5 times. So I want to loop 5 times, let I equal 0. I is less than 5, I plus plus, and I want to yield a number between 1 and 10. So how do I do that? Technically, we have min and max, right? So we saw right here, if I take, where was it? Random from range. So for example, if I take this formula here, I'll just copy this for sake of example here, and I paste it here. I want to yield a random number, right, between a min and a max. So in my case, my max is 10, and then my min is 1, right? And you can probably see there's some redundant math going on here, but I'll just leave that there just so it's super clear that this formula really does work. And we want to yield out that value, right? A number between 1 and 10. Cool. So that's our generator for that one. Then we want to create our grocery list generator. And inside of there, we're going to create this array. So avocado, cookie, milk, soup, and soda. I just realized as I was reading these instructions, this looks kind of odd to me. This is not how you spell avocado. You definitely spell it with an O right there. So hopefully that, and probably right here as well, I should probably correct that. Avocado, one of my favorite fruits, I guess that would be. Is it a vegetable? Is it a fruit? I don't actually know, but they're delicious. So I hope I want to spell them correctly here for you. So that said, let's actually get to our grocery list. So we're going to say const. I'm just going to try to not cover too much of this. So I'll just kind of scroll down a tiny bit here. Grocery list. This is going to be a function star. And inside of here is where we kind of get quite fancy. So we want to say const groceries, right? Is going to point to our lists with our correctly spelled avocado in there, right? And I'll scroll down here. So we want to be able to yield a random grocery from our grocery list and then be able to remove that item from the list so we can't accidentally get it again, okay? So we need to be able to pick something from this list every time we kind of yield from it. Okay, so let's think about this. When this function gets called, we want it to pick out something random and then loop back and pick out something random again. Okay, so let's create a loop to actually do that. So I'll say for let I equal 0, And I want to loop basically the amount of times that I have groceries. So in this case, there's 5, but I'll just do it in a more dynamic way. I'll start at 0, and I'll say while while I is less than groceries.length, right? In case we were to add more of these in the future, and I'll say I++. So what do I want to do? I want to basically pull out a value from this array permanently. I want to kind of permanently manipulate this array in place so that I can't accidentally grab it again. So let's Google for that and see how we can actually get that to work. So I'll just go back here. I'll go back to Google and I'll say JavaScript, I guess delete item from array. All right, so we have a couple of things here. I'm going to go with MDN. I'm going to pull up this just as a backup for my Stack Overflow, but I'm going to go with splice here. We've used this before. Method changes the contents of array by removing or replacing existing elements and adding new elements in place. To access a part of the array without modifying it, see slice. So we do want to modify it, so we're going to use splice. These names are very, very confusing. Splice modifies it in place, so it actually permanently changes that array. Slice will create a copy very similar to map, filter, and reduce. So let's look at these examples here. I think I always get confused by these examples by splice because they sometimes try to add stuff. But in this case, I think they're saying splice it starting at index 1, which is March. And then we want to kind of remove nothing, I guess, and we want to add February. Right, so they're basically saying at index 1, add February. That's definitely not what we want. We want to remove an item. So here, maybe removing an item 4, which is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's going to be right at the end. They want to remove an item and replace it with May. So in this case, we're replacing June with May, but we don't want to replace an item. We just want to remove it. So we can actually eliminate this last argument right here. So we can just say these two arguments. So if we scroll down a bit, we can actually see the starting index and then the delete count. Okay. So the most important thing also here is the return value. So if I actually take a look at what this method returns, because I actually want that value as well, maybe I can actually do this both in one step. So if I scroll down, return value, which is an array containing the deleted element. If only one element is removed, an array of one element is returned. If no elements are removed, an empty array is returned. So we're going to get back this in theory if we only remove one item, which is an array of one element. So we have to pull out the first item inside of that array, which is going to be index 0. Okay. So we can kind of do it two ways. So first, let's generate a random index. So I'm going to say const random index is equal to, and I want to generate a number between 0 and the array.length. So I'm going to say math.floor of math.random. And then in this case, we can just multiply it by the max because we don't actually have a min that is different from a 0. And we saw this in the MDN example earlier. So the max is going to be the groceries.length. So this will generate a random index between 0 and then the length of the array. So in this case, between 0 and 5 inclusive. Okay, or 0 and 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. 0 and 4 because it's always array.length minus 1. Okay, so we're going to get a number between 0 and 4, and we can pull that out of the actual array. So now we can actually splice this array. So I'm going to say const, I guess, removed item is equal to, and then we can remove the item using splice. So I can do this in 2 steps or 1 step. I'll just show you kind of how you might be able to do this in 1 step since we've seen the 2-step method kind of in previous videos. So I'm going to say we're going to take groceries and we're going to splice it. And we want to start at the random index and we want to remove one item. Okay, this we saw is going to give us back an array with one item in it. So I actually want to pull out the first element from that array. So this is a bit of a confusing line. So just read this as we want to pull out one item from this array. We're going to get back an array as MDN specified to us. If only one element is removed, an array of one item is returned, right? And for an array of one item, to get the one item out of the array, we index 0 to get that item. Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense. And what we want to do now is we want to actually yield that value. So we want to yield the removed item. All right, so the way that this works is we're going to loop, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. And each time we're going to generate a random index. So for example, let's say index 1, right? If we generated 1, if this number was 1, then we would go into index 1, we would remove it. So we'd remove cookie. So then we'd have avocado, milk, soup, and soda left. Then we would grab the removed item using the array notation, since this function actually gives us back an array. So splice will give us back an array of values, even if one item is returned. I actually thought it would just be one value if the one item was returned, but I guess they want to keep it consistent. Okay, so definitely a bit of a complicated function there. Hopefully you can read through that and eventually get it. This line, arguably, you could split up into a few lines, but I just wanted to show you how you can make the code a bit more concise. In theory, since I'm actually not using removed item anywhere else, I could actually yield this value directly and actually make this only 2 lines of code. Okay, so next, what we want to do is we want to create 2 generator objects by calling each of these functions. Okay, so I'm going to say const, and I'll just call this random number generator, now that we've seen this a few times. So you can see maybe how you can name this a bit better. And this will be called get random number. Then I'm going to create the grocery list. Grocery generator is equal to grocery list. Okay, and now these are the actual generator objects, which I can call next on to pull values out of. So now we're on our last step. We want to create a for loop that will loop 5 times and call next on each of our objects. So let's just create a for loop to start. We'll say for let I equal 0, I is less than 5, and I plus plus. So this is going to loop 5 times. So we have a loop that's going to loop 5 times. Now, what do we want to do in each of these loops? Well, we want to actually pull out values from these generators and kind of shove them side by side inside of a string. So I'm going to do this in kind of 3 steps. I'm going to pull out the values and then I'm going to put them into a string. So I'm going to say const random number, and to get a random number from our random number generator, we use the .next, and we can pull out the .value property off of that when we're using the .next syntax and we're outside of a for of loop. So I'll say random number generator .next .value. And I'll do the same thing for grocery generator. I'll say const grocery is equal to grocery generator .next .value. Okay. And that's going to give me the actual string that we pulled out, because that's what we told it to do right here. Okay. And then I want to actually log out the number beside the actual grocery item. So I'm going to do a template string for this. So I'll do backticks, and then I'm going to put the number, and then I'll put beside it the actual grocery item. I could just do a console log with a comma, but just so we get used to seeing this syntax, because we're going to use it a lot, I'll start using this some more. And in here, we're going to put grocery. Okay, this is probably grocery item is a better word for this, but I'll just go with that. All right, so that was a lot of code all at once. Let's actually see if this works, or if it's an infinite loop, or like what is happening with this code. So I'll do node exercise3.js, fingers crossed. And look at that. Okay, so we get almost the right value. We get 3 soda, 9 avocado, 10 cookie, and then 7 is undefined and 10 is undefined. If we run this one more time, milk, soda, avocado, 6 undefined, 8 undefined. Interesting. So we kind of seem to be always just getting the last 2 values of undefined. So let's actually just debug this really quick together. Okay, so I'm glad this actually came up. This is actually quite a tricky one. I'm going to try to see if I can debug this on the fly. I'm not entirely sure why this might be happening. So let's do some kind of live debugging because generators can get quite tricky. And I have a feeling that this might be some kind of variable or maybe even some kind of scoping issue, which we haven't really dealt with yet. So here I'm seeing that I'm getting undefined. So let me just kind of think of why that is before I start poking around too much. So here, undefined is probably telling me that this generator has ended, right? Because this generator right here, 4, 2, 4, 10, and 5, that's our math generator, right? And that one seems to keep going, right? So this one seems to be okay. What seems to be undefined though is our value from calling next on our grocery generator. So I have a feeling that this one is like done, right? Our grocery generator is probably actually complete. So let's actually see if that's true. So I'm going to console.log out. I'll just move this up here. Grocery Actually, what I'll do, before I do that, I'll say const grocery is equal to grocery generator.next, right? And I want to log out, I'll comment this out for now. I'll say log out grocery dot, or just grocery itself. And then here I'm going to log out grocery dot value. Okay, so I'm just going to change this code a little bit just so we can actually see the actual full object so we can see if it's done or not. So I'm just going to clear this code. I'll just run this one more time. And it looks like our intuition is correct, right? So we have milk avocado cookie for our generator for our grocery list, and it's undefined and done is true. So this seems to be returning early for some reason. Okay, so why might that be? I'll leave that log in there. Actually, you know what? I'll take that log out and I'll just leave this log in there because we actually know what's coming out from there. So it looks like every single time we're looping only 3 times. So we're looping 3 times every single time, no matter what. So why 3? That really is the question. Why do we stop after 3? So let's read through this code. We have our list. We're saying loop from 0 until the list.length. Okay. I'm kind of seeing maybe a potential issue here. We're generating a random index that goes up to the length. Maybe the issue's here. I don't actually know. But the length here, maybe that's an issue. One of these. We're removing the item. That shouldn't be too much of an issue. This is in place, right? So we're changing this array in place. Then we're yielding that value, and that's not really an issue too either. So what I'm guessing is that when we're splicing this list, the size of this list is actually changing underneath it. And since we're using groceries.length, this actually gets updated and is kind of the live value for this grocery list is my guess. Okay. So let's see if that's true. So first what I'll do is actually I'll just console.log out a random index and see if we're even on the right track. So we get 1, 0, 2 for the random index. Okay, and then we get undefined. Then we get a 0. So the random index is working, but it's only generating 3. Okay, so let's see what happens if we log out groceries.length alongside this. So I'll do groceries.length. Now I have a feeling we might be onto something. Oh, wow. Okay. So I think the intuition is correct. So check that out, right? So we're generating random indexes correctly, but the length of the array is changing because we're actually using splice. Now, this is kind of what I hinted at previously, and it's kind of hard to intuit this until you actually start coding more. Changing arrays using something like splice and changing pretty much any object in place is quite dangerous. And this is a really good example of why in practice, right? Because we are just magically kind of pulling out this length property, and we expect it to be something, but then under us it gets swapped out to be something else, right? It's actually changing from 5 to 4 to 3 and breaking out of our loop earlier than we wanted it to. Okay, so that's happening because the splice is manipulating this array, which is also changing its length in place. All right, so I can probably think of a solution for this. We can just pull out the length right away up here. So I can see grocery length is equal to groceries.length. I could hard code this to something like 5, but I'll just show you how you could do this with still using the length property. And now that I have this value kind of cached up here, where I have that value kind of statically generated one time before this loop starts, instead of recalculating the length every single loop, I'll just put it as the actual value, which is going to be 5 right here. So if I rerun this, look at that. It looks like we're actually getting the correct value. So this number is being generated, and you can see the length in this case is actually changing correctly, but we're actually still using grocery length in this case. And you can see that we're pulling out soda and soup. So if I actually log out grocery length here, which is our cache value, you're going to see that that stays at 5 every single time, right? So the length of the array is changing, but our loop length is still always going to remain at 5. And this is the loop kind of condition to break out of the loop while we're I is less than 5 in this case. Okay, so definitely a tricky one. Let me remove that log so we can kind of see the final solution here, and I'll leave those debugging logs in there. We can see that we get different numbers for our different values in our grocery list. And I can run this a couple of times and kind of get different numbers between 1 and 10, and all of our values are being pulled out correctly randomly. Okay, so that was definitely a very, very challenging one. I hope that wasn't too bad and gave you a bit of practice with different things as well as generators. What we're going to do in the next video is actually go over another concept with generators called asynchronous generators, which is going to add even more power on top of this concept of generators. And that's truly going to be quite a mind-blowing concept. I know when I first started playing with them when they came out, it was quite amazing, the power that they have. We're going to go through a series of exercises for that as well, and see how they kind of work with promises and how they relate to async and await. The entire purpose of going through generators and async generators is really to get a good intuition for how this kind of looping works in JavaScript, how we can go over and iterate through different data structures and constructs, as well as how async and await and synchronous and asynchronous code might work, and really the power behind JavaScript and how it can schedule things to run lazily in the future, or even lazily right now in the case of generators. And just the syntax is very, very kind of concise in the case of generators specifically. So I hope you found this video valuable and challenging enough for you. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear in the comments what you thought of these exercises. I know they are quite complicated, but did you find them challenging? Did you run into the same issues that I ran into? Do you find uses for these generators now you've practiced them a couple of times? I'd love to hear in the comments what you think of the topic. And that said, I guess what we'll do is go into the next video, which is talk about asynchronous generators, which is going to totally be a mind-blowing experience, and I really, really can't wait. You can see the huge smile on my face. So I can't wait to see you there. I'll see you in the asynchronous generator video.